You're about to hear a feel-good, yet mesmerizing narrative. A truly emotional story of a wealthy millionaire whose life takes an unexpected turn on a snowy Christmas Eve. Through a chance encounter, the walls of wealth and solitude begin to crumble, revealing the hunger for connection during the quiet magic of the season. Lay back, relax, and let us guide you into a setting where you feel calm and comfortable. The air outside was crisp and cold, with soft snow falling quietly on the empty streets. Lights twinkled on rooftops and in shop windows, their warm glow standing out against the night sky. Christmas was just days away, and the city seemed to hum with quiet anticipation. Daniel Gray, a successful businessman, sat in his office on the top floor of a tall building. The view outside was breathtaking, but Daniel barely noticed. He leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his dark hair, feeling the weight of the season. His desk was neat, but the silence in the room was heavy, pressing on him like an invisible fog. Daniel was 35 years old, a man who had built a life most people could only dream of. He owned multiple companies, had more money than he could ever spend, and lived in a house so big it sometimes felt empty. But no amount of success seemed to fill the quiet spaces in his life. This year, Christmas felt heavier than usual. His family had invited him to their grand annual dinner, as they did every year. And every year, it was the same. Polite smiles, cold conversations, and his mother's sharp questions about why he was still single. "Daniel, when will we meet someone special?" she had asked last Christmas, her tone more critical than curious. Daniel hadn't answered then, and he didn't want to answer now. He sighed, closing his eyes, the memory replaying like an old film. A soft chime from his phone broke the silence. Daniel opened his eyes and picked up the phone. It was a reminder for a meeting he'd scheduled earlier in the week, a meeting he still wasn't sure about. But desperate times called for desperate measures. Daniel straightened his suit, grabbed his coat, and left his office. The city lights greeted him as he stepped into the chilled air, and he walked toward a small cafe tucked between two tall buildings. Inside, the warmth hit him immediately, along with the faint smell of coffee and cinnamon. Sitting at a table by the window was a woman. She had warm brown eyes, a kind face, and a calm presence that made her stand out in the bustling cafe. Her name was Emma Carter, and Daniel had found her profile online. She was an actress, offering her services for small events or roles. Daniel approached her table, his steps deliberate. "Emma Carter?" he asked softly. She looked up and smiled, motioning for him to sit. "Yes, and you must be Daniel Gray," she said, her voice gentle but confident. Daniel nodded, pulling out the chair. He sat across from her, taking a deep breath before speaking. "I need your help," he began, his tone serious but calm. Emma listened as Daniel explained the situation. He told her about his family, their expectations, and the dreaded Christmas dinner. "Every year it's the same," he said, his gaze dropping to the table. "They ask why I'm still single, why I haven't started a family. I can't face it this year. So I need someone to play the part." Emma studied him for a moment, her head tilting slightly. She didn't interrupt. Instead, she let him continue, her expression open and kind. "I'll pay you well," Daniel added quickly, as though trying to fill the silence. "You won't have to do much. Just meet my family, smile, and answer a few questions. It's one evening, and then it's over." Emma folded her hands on the table, her expression thoughtful. "It sounds simple," she said softly, "but why does it matter so much to you?" Daniel hesitated, caught off guard by the question. He had expected her to agree without much thought, but Emma's calm gaze seemed to invite honesty. He sighed. "Because they don't see me for who I am. To them, I'm just a successful businessman who's failing in one thing: family. I want them to leave me alone for once." Emma nodded slowly, her expression softening. "All right," she said, her tone gentle. "I'll help you, but I have one condition." Daniel raised an eyebrow, waiting for her to continue. "I need to know more about you," Emma said. "If I'm going to play this role, I need to understand the part. That means knowing about your family, your childhood, and what makes you, you." Daniel frowned slightly. He wasn't used to sharing personal details, but something about Emma's steady presence made him feel that maybe, just this once, it would be all right. "Okay," he said after a pause. "We'll meet again, and I'll tell you what you need to know." Over the next few days, Daniel and Emma met a few more times. Each meeting was simple and calm, held in quiet spaces where they could talk without interruption. Daniel told Emma about his family, his mother Margaret, who was strict and cared deeply about appearances, his father Edward, who rarely spoke but always found a way to criticize, and his younger sister Clara, who often asked too many questions. Emma listened carefully, asking gentle questions when needed. She made notes, learning every detail she could. Daniel found himself surprised by how easy it was to talk to her. She never judged or interrupted. Instead, she had a way of making him feel understood. One evening, after their meeting, Daniel stood by his car, watching the snow fall softly around him. His breath was visible in the cold air, and for the first time in a while, he felt a faint sense of calm. Maybe, just maybe, this plan would work. On Christmas Eve, the day of the dinner, Daniel stood in his hallway, adjusting his tie in the mirror. His house was quiet, the only sound coming from the faint ticking of a clock. A knock on the door broke the stillness, and Daniel turned, walking over to open it. Emma stood there, dressed in a deep red coat, with a soft scarf around her neck. Her smile was warm, and her presence seemed to fill the empty space of the hallway. "Are you ready?" she asked gently. Daniel nodded, stepping aside to let her in. He grabbed his coat and gloves, and together they walked out into the snowy evening. As they drove to his family's estate, the car was quiet, save for the faint sound of Christmas music on the radio. Emma hummed softly along to the tune, her voice light and soothing. Daniel glanced at her, feeling a small sense of comfort in her presence. The car pulled up to the estate, its windows glowing warmly against the snowy backdrop. Daniel parked and turned to Emma. "This is it," he said softly. Emma smiled, her voice calm. "Then let's make this a night to remember." The Gray family estate stood tall and proud, surrounded by frost-covered trees and blanketed in soft snow. Golden light spilled from the large windows, casting a warm glow onto the driveway. Daniel and Emma stepped out of the car, their shoes crunching on the fresh snow as they walked toward the grand entrance. Emma glanced at Daniel, her voice soft. "You grew up here?" Daniel nodded. "Yes, it's beautiful, isn't it? But it never really felt like home." Emma gave him a small smile, sensing the tension in his words, but not pressing further. The large double doors opened as they approached, revealing a smartly dressed butler who greeted them with a polite bow. "Good evening, Mr. Gray. Mrs. Gray and the family are waiting in the main hall." "Thank you," Daniel replied, his voice steady. He turned to Emma and gestured for her to follow. The main hall was grand, with high ceilings, marble floors, and a towering Christmas tree decorated in gold and white. The room smelled faintly of pine and cinnamon, a hint of warmth in the otherwise formal setting. "Daniel!" a sharp voice called out, breaking the calm. Margaret Gray, dressed in an elegant emerald green dress, approached with the air of someone used to being in charge. Her eyes immediately landed on Emma, scanning her carefully. "And who is this?" Margaret asked, her tone polite but edged with curiosity. Daniel stepped forward, his hand brushing Emma's arm lightly. "Mother, this is Emma, my fiancée." For a moment, Margaret's expression didn't change. Then she smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Emma, welcome. It's lovely to meet you." Emma returned the smile, her voice calm and warm. "Thank you, Mrs. Gray. Your home is beautiful, and the decorations are stunning." Margaret nodded, seeming pleased with the compliment. "We do our best every year. Christmas is important in this family." Daniel felt his shoulders tense, but Emma's steady presence beside him eased the tightness slightly. As more family members gathered in the hall, introductions were made. Edward Gray, tall and imposing with a quiet demeanour, greeted Emma with a simple nod. Clara, Daniel's younger sister, offered a warm but curious smile. "It's nice to meet you, Emma," Clara said, her tone lighter than her mother's. "I hope Daniel's been treating you well." Emma chuckled softly, sensing the playfulness in Clara's words. "He has. He's been wonderful." As the evening progressed, everyone moved to the grand dining room. The long table was set with fine china, crystal glasses, and silver candlesticks. A faint hum of holiday music played in the background, though the atmosphere felt far from relaxed. Emma sat beside Daniel, with Clara on her other side. Margaret took her place at the head of the table, her posture perfect, while Edward sat silently across from Daniel. The first course was served, and polite conversation filled the air. Clara leaned closer to Emma, her voice low but cheerful. "So, Emma, how did you and Daniel meet?" Emma had prepared for this question. Smiling gently, she said, "We met at a charity event. Daniel was kind enough to help with some of the organising, and we started talking. I was drawn to how thoughtful he was." Daniel glanced at Emma briefly, surprised by her smooth delivery. Clara raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "Thoughtful? That's not a word I hear often about my brother." Emma laughed softly, her tone light. "Well, maybe he just hides that side well." Across the table, Margaret watched the exchange closely. "Charity event, you say? Daniel doesn't usually attend those." Emma met Margaret's gaze calmly. "Yes, it was a lovely event. Daniel mentioned wanting to give back during the holidays. I thought it was admirable." Daniel took a sip of water, hoping his mother wouldn't press further. To his relief, Margaret simply nodded, though her expression remained thoughtful. As the meal continued, Emma observed the family dynamics. Margaret dominated the conversation, steering it toward topics that highlighted the family's success. Edward spoke sparingly, his words often blunt. Clara, though cheerful, seemed careful not to upset the balance. At one point, Margaret turned to Emma again. "And you, dear, what do you do?" Emma set her fork down gracefully. "I'm an actress. I love telling stories and helping people connect through emotions." Margaret's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of surprise crossing her face. "An actress? That's interesting." "Yes," Emma replied, her tone steady. "It's not always easy, but it's fulfilling. Daniel has been very supportive of my work." Daniel looked down at his plate, hiding his discomfort. He wasn't used to being described in such a kind light, even if it was part of the act. Margaret gave a small, polite smile. "Well, it sounds like you found your passion. That's important." After dinner, the family moved to the living room for drinks and dessert. The large fireplace crackled softly, casting a warm glow over the room. Emma sat on the couch beside Daniel, her hands resting lightly in her lap. Margaret poured herself a glass of wine and sat across from them, her sharp eyes never leaving Emma. "So, Emma," she began, her voice soft but probing, "what do you see in Daniel?" Emma smiled gently, her voice calm. "Daniel is smart, driven, and honest. He inspires me to be the best version of myself." Margaret raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "Interesting. He doesn't strike me as the sentimental type." Emma's smile didn't falter. Sometimes the best qualities aren't the most obvious. Daniel felt a flicker of unease. He wasn't sure if Margaret believed Emma, but he was grateful for her composure. As the night wound down, the family began to disperse. Margaret excused herself to her room, while Edward retreated to his study. Clara lingered briefly, offering Emma a genuine smile before heading upstairs. Daniel and Emma were left alone in the quiet living room, the fire casting shadows on the walls. "You handled them well," Daniel said softly, breaking the silence. Emma turned to him, her expression warm. "Your family isn't as bad as you made them sound. They're just complicated." Daniel gave a faint smile, though his eyes were tired. "That's one way to put it." Emma leaned back slightly, her voice softer. "You don't have to carry all of this alone, you know. Sometimes it helps to let people in." Daniel didn't reply, his gaze fixed on the fire. The warmth of the room contrasted with the heaviness in his chest, and for a moment he felt the faintest crack in his carefully built walls. The house was calm now, the sounds of laughter and conversation fading into the silence of the night. Daniel and Emma remained in the living room, the glow of the Christmas tree softly illuminating the space. The fire crackled gently, sending flickers of light across the walls. Emma glanced at Daniel, noticing the tension in his shoulders. "You're quieter than usual," she said softly. Daniel leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped. I don't know why I do this every year," he said after a moment. "It's like walking into a performance where the script never changes. They expect me to act the part, but it's exhausting." Emma tilted her head, her voice calm. "What part do they want you to play?" Daniel exhaled slowly. The perfect son, the successful businessman, the one who has everything under control. But no matter what I do, it's never enough for them. Emma leaned back, her hands resting in her lap. "Have you ever told them how you feel?" Daniel shook his head, his gaze fixed on the flickering flames. "No. What would be the point? They wouldn't understand." Emma watched him quietly for a moment before speaking. "Sometimes it's not about whether they understand. It's about giving yourself the freedom to say it, to let it out." Daniel turned to her, his expression unreadable. "You make it sound so easy." Emma smiled gently. "It's not easy, but holding everything in is even harder." The next morning, Daniel woke to the soft sound of snow falling against the windows. He stretched, the weight of the previous evening still heavy on his mind. For a moment, he considered staying in his room, avoiding the inevitable conversations that would come with breakfast. But then, he thought of Emma. She had handled his family with grace and warmth, smoothing over the tension with her calm presence. If she could face them with such ease, surely he could try too. In the dining room, breakfast was a quieter affair. The table was set with warm pastries, fresh fruit, and steaming cups of coffee. The family gathered slowly, their voices low as they greeted one another. Emma arrived shortly after Daniel, her smile as soft and warm as the morning light. She sat beside him, her movements unhurried and calm. "Good morning," she said, her voice soothing. Daniel nodded, offering her a small smile. "Good morning." Clara, seated across from them, looked at Emma curiously. "So, Emma, what do you usually do on Christmas morning?" Emma paused, her hands wrapping around her coffee cup. "My family always kept it simple," she said, her tone reflective. "We'd make hot cocoa and watch Christmas movies together. It wasn't fancy, but it was cozy. It always felt warm." Margaret, seated at the head of the table, raised an eyebrow. "And do you miss that?" Emma met her gaze with a gentle smile. I do, but I think Christmas is special wherever you are, as long as you're with people who care. Margaret didn't respond immediately, her expression thoughtful. Daniel glanced at Emma, surprised by her answer. It wasn't just smooth, it felt genuine. After breakfast, the family scattered to their usual routines. Edward disappeared into his study. Margaret busied herself with holiday preparations, and Clara retreated to her room. Daniel found himself alone with Emma in the sitting room, where the soft glow of the Christmas tree created a quiet, peaceful atmosphere. Emma settled into an armchair, her gaze drifting to the snow-covered garden outside. It's beautiful here, she said softly, but it feels heavy. Daniel looked at her, his brow furrowing. What do you mean? Emma turned to him, her expression gentle. This house, your family, it's like they're carrying something they can't put down. Expectations, maybe, or regrets. Daniel leaned back, his hands resting on the arm of the couch. That's how it's always been. My parents built this life from nothing, and now they expect us to carry it forward. Success is all they've ever cared about. Emma nodded slowly. And what do you care about, Daniel? The question hung in the air, soft but heavy. Daniel opened his mouth to answer, but closed it again, unsure of what to say. He had spent so much of his life chasing success, he wasn't sure what he truly wanted anymore. As the day passed, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the estate in a soft white hush. Daniel and Emma spent the afternoon in the library, where a fire burned quietly in the corner. The room smelled of aged books and pine, a comforting mix that seemed to slow time. Emma browsed the shelves, running her fingers along the spines of old books. Did you read these as a child? She asked, her voice breaking the silence. Daniel glanced up from the couch, where he sat with a book in his lap. Some of them, he said, but I was always too busy with school or work. My parents didn't think reading for fun was a good use of time. Emma pulled a book from the shelf, her smile soft. Well, maybe it's never too late to start. She sat beside him, opening the book to a random page. The quiet sound of pages turning filled the room, mingling with the crackle of the fire. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence feeling warm and full rather than empty. That evening, the family gathered again for dinner. The table was quieter than the night before, the weight of unspoken words lingering in the air. Daniel sat beside Emma, his gaze drifting to the snow falling gently outside. Emma noticed his quietness and leaned closer, her voice low. Are you all right? Daniel nodded slightly. I'm fine, just thinking. Emma didn't press him, sensing that he needed space. Instead, she turned her attention back to the table, where Margaret was discussing plans for the following day. As the meal ended, Margaret stood, her voice carrying across the room. We'll gather in the living room for our usual Christmas Eve tradition, she said. Drinks and conversation by the fire. Daniel sighed quietly, but Emma placed a reassuring hand on his arm. You'll be fine, she said softly, her touch grounding him. The living room felt warm and inviting, the fire casting golden light across the walls. The family settled into their usual seats, the tension in the air lightened by the flickering flames. Clara broke the silence with a light-hearted story, her laughter filling the room like a soft melody. Emma sat beside Daniel, her presence steady and calm. As the evening went on, she noticed how Daniel seemed to relax, his shoulders softening as the warmth of the room wrapped around him. For the first time, Daniel felt a small glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this Christmas wouldn't be as heavy as the ones before. The living room had quieted. The fire in the grand hearth burned low, its soft warmth spreading through the space. Emma sat on the couch, a steaming cup of tea in her hands. Across from her, Daniel stared into the glowing embers, his expression far away. "Your family seems calmer tonight," Emma said softly, her voice like a gentle ripple across the silence. Daniel glanced at her, the flicker of a tired smile crossing his lips. "They're exhausted," he replied. "Keeping up appearances is hard work." Emma tilted her head, her gaze warm. "And what about you? How are you holding up?" Daniel leaned back, running a hand through his hair. "I'm trying," he admitted. "This isn't easy for me. They expect so much, and I've spent my whole life trying not to disappoint them." Emma set her cup down on the table in front of her, folding her hands neatly in her lap. "What would happen if you did disappoint them?" she asked gently. Daniel frowned, the question catching him off guard. "I don't know," he said after a pause. "I guess I've never let myself think about it. Failure wasn't an option in our house. My parents worked too hard to give us this life." Emma nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. "But is it really failure to want something different?" Daniel didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked back at the fire, the flames reflecting in his eyes. "I don't know," he said quietly. "Maybe it's just easier to keep doing what they expect." Emma leaned forward slightly, her voice soft but firm. "Easier doesn't always mean better, Daniel." Later that evening, as the family began to disperse, Daniel found himself lingering in the quiet library. The room was dimly lit, with just the soft glow of a lamp on the desk. Snow continued to fall outside, the world beyond the windows silent and still. Emma appeared in the doorway, her footsteps light on the wooden floor. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked gently. Daniel shook his head, gesturing for her to come in. "Too much on my mind," he said. Emma crossed the room and sat in the armchair opposite him. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence between them feeling comfortable. "You've been good at this," Daniel said finally, his voice low. "Playing the role, I mean. My family seems convinced." Emma smiled faintly. "It's not just a role, you know. I've learned a lot about you these past few days. And what I've seen, it makes me think you're much more than the man you think you have to be." Daniel looked at her, his brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "I mean that you're kind," Emma said simply. "Even if you don't show it all the time. You care about people more than you let on. And you're tired of pretending you don't." Daniel's gaze dropped to his hands, her words striking something deep within him. "It's hard to be honest when you've spent your whole life trying to meet someone else's expectations," he said softly. Emma nodded, her voice warm. But honesty is where things start to change, even if it's just a little at a time. Christmas morning arrived with a gentle light streaming through the windows of the estate. The snow outside sparkled under the soft sun, and the house felt quieter than it had the day before. Daniel stepped into the sitting room, where the Christmas tree stood tall and glowing. Emma was already there, sitting on the floor beside the tree, her face lit with a peaceful smile. She was carefully unwrapping a small box, one of the gifts that had been placed under the tree the night before. Daniel watched her for a moment, the scene so calm it almost felt surreal. He cleared his throat lightly, and Emma looked up, her smile widening. "Good morning," she said softly. "Good morning," Daniel replied, stepping closer. "You're up early." Emma chuckled lightly. "I couldn't resist. Christmas morning has always been my favourite time of the year." Daniel sat down on the couch, his posture more relaxed than it had been in days. "What's your favourite part about it?" he asked, his voice genuinely curious. Emma thought for a moment, her hands resting in her lap. "The quiet," she said finally. "The world feels softer on Christmas morning. Everything slows down, and for a little while, it feels like nothing else matters." Daniel nodded, her words settling over him like a warm blanket. He glanced at the tree, its lights twinkling softly. "I don't think I've ever thought about it that way," he admitted. Emma turned to him, her gaze steady. "Maybe this year is your chance to start." Later that day, the family gathered for brunch in the dining room. The table was set with simple but elegant dishes, and the atmosphere felt lighter than it had in days. Clara chatted happily with Emma, while Margaret sipped her coffee quietly, her sharp edges softened. Daniel observed the scene, a small sense of relief washing over him. For the first time, the family gathering didn't feel like a performance. It felt almost real. As the meal came to an end, Margaret cleared her throat, drawing everyone's attention. "Before we all go our separate ways, I just want to say thank you," she said, her tone softer than usual. "It's been a lovely Christmas, and it's been nice to have everyone together." Emma glanced at Daniel, a small smile playing on her lips. He returned the smile, feeling a faint warmth in his chest. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Daniel and Emma found themselves walking through the snowy garden outside the estate. The air was crisp, their breaths visible as they spoke. "This feels different," Daniel said, his voice thoughtful. "This Christmas, I mean. It doesn't feel as heavy as before." Emma glanced at him, her smile soft. "Maybe it's because you've started letting yourself feel it. The good parts, I mean." Daniel nodded, his gaze fixed on the snow-covered path ahead. "It's strange," he said quietly. "I spent so much time trying to make things perfect. But now I'm starting to see that maybe it doesn't have to be." Emma stopped walking, turning to face him. "Perfect isn't real, Daniel," she said gently. "But connection is. And that's what makes everything feel worth it." Daniel looked at her, his expression softening. "You've taught me a lot in these past few days," he said. "More than I expected to learn." Emma smiled, her eyes warm. "And you've shown me that even the most guarded hearts can open if they're willing to try." The snow continued to fall softly around them, the world feeling quiet and full. For the first time in years, Daniel felt a sense of peace, the weight of his past slowly lifting. The evening had settled into a deep calm, the estate quieter than it had been all weekend. Most of the family had retired to their rooms, leaving Daniel and Emma alone once more in the living room. The fire burned low, its warmth filling the space as the glow of the Christmas tree reflected in the glass of the tall windows. Daniel leaned back on the couch, his gaze on the flames. "It feels strange," he said softly. Emma, seated beside him, turned her head slightly. "What does?" "Everything," Daniel replied after a pause. "This Christmas, it's not what I expected, and I don't mean just the dinner or my family. I mean you. I thought this would be simple, just a role, a transaction. But you've managed to change so much in just a few days." Emma gave him a small, knowing smile. "I didn't change anything, Daniel. You did that yourself. I just reminded you what you already knew deep down." Daniel looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe, but it feels like you've been holding up a mirror, showing me the parts of myself I've been ignoring." Emma tilted her head, her voice soft. "And what do you see in that mirror?" Daniel's brow furrowed as he thought. "Someone who's tired of pretending," he said finally. "Someone who wants more than just success. I think I've spent so much of my life chasing what I thought I needed. I forgot to stop and ask what I actually want." Emma's smile widened, her eyes warm. "And have you figured it out?" Daniel shook his head, a faint smile on his lips. "Not completely, but I think I'm starting to." The next morning, Christmas Day, the estate was bathed in soft light as the snow glittered outside. Breakfast was simple and quiet, a noticeable difference from the formal meals of the previous days. Clara sat beside Emma, chatting easily, while Margaret and Edward spoke in hushed tones at the other end of the table. Daniel watched the scene unfold, feeling a sense of quiet relief. For the first time, his family felt less like a collection of roles and more like people simply existing together. After breakfast, Margaret approached Emma with a polite smile. "Emma, I wanted to thank you for joining us this year. It's been refreshing to have someone new at the table." Emma returned the smile, her tone kind. "Thank you for having me, Mrs. Gray. It's been lovely getting to know all of you." Margaret hesitated for a moment, her expression softening. "You've been good for Daniel," she said quietly. "I can see that. He's different this year, lighter." Emma's smile didn't falter, though her heart skipped slightly at Margaret's words. "I think Daniel is starting to let himself be more honest," she said gently, "and that's always a good thing." Margaret nodded slowly, her gaze thoughtful. "Yes, I suppose it is." Later that day, Daniel and Emma found themselves walking through the snowy garden again. The air was crisp, the world quiet except for the soft crunch of their footsteps on the snow. "You've done more for my family than I ever thought possible," Daniel said, his tone genuine. "Even my mother seems softer. That's a miracle in itself." Emma laughed lightly, the sound like a bell in the still air. "I think your family just needed a little reminder of what matters. Sometimes we get so caught up in expectations we forget the simple things, like just being together." Daniel nodded, his hands tucked into his coat pockets. "You make it sound so simple, but I've spent years trying to figure it out, and I never could." Emma stopped walking, turning to face him. "It's not simple," she said softly, "but it starts with letting go of what you think you have to be. You don't need to prove anything, Daniel. You just need to be yourself." Daniel met her gaze, his expression vulnerable. "And what if I'm still figuring out who that is?" Emma smiled gently. "Then you're already on the right path." As the day turned into evening, the family gathered one last time in the living room. The fire burned brightly, casting a warm glow over the room. Clara played soft Christmas music on the piano, her fingers gliding over the keys with ease. Emma sat beside Daniel on the couch, her presence a steady comfort. Margaret and Edward sat together near the tree, their voices low as they spoke. It was a peaceful moment, one that felt unforced and real. Daniel looked around the room, a small smile tugging at his lips. For the first time, the weight he carried felt a little lighter. As the evening wound down, Emma excused herself, leaving Daniel alone by the fire. Clara approached him, her smile teasing but kind. "You've changed this year, Daniel," she said lightly. "I don't know what Emma's done to you, but I like it." Daniel chuckled softly, shaking his head. "It's not just Emma. I think I've just started seeing things differently." Clara raised an eyebrow. "Well, whatever it is, keep it up. It's nice to see you smile for once." That night, as the snow fell softly outside, Daniel found Emma standing by the tall windows in the living room, the tree's lights reflected in the glass, casting a warm glow over her face. "I wanted to thank you," Daniel said, his voice quiet as he approached. Emma turned to him, her expression curious. "For what?" "For everything," Daniel replied, his tone earnest. "You didn't just help me with my family. You helped me see things I've been ignoring for years. I don't think I can ever repay you for that." Emma smiled, her voice warm. "You don't owe me anything, Daniel. I think you've done most of the work yourself." Daniel hesitated, his gaze softening. "Still, I want you to know how much this has meant to me, and I don't want it to end here." Emma tilted her head slightly, her smile widening, "What are you saying, Daniel?" "I'm saying I want to keep seeing you," Daniel said, his voice steady but vulnerable, "not as a role or part of some plan, just as you." Emma's eyes glimmered with emotion as she nodded. "I'd like that," she said softly. Daniel smiled, a warmth spreading through his chest. For the first time in years, he felt like he was stepping into something real, something worth holding on to. The next morning, the estate was quiet as the family prepared to leave. Daniel and Emma stood together by the front door, watching as the snow continued to fall. As the cars pulled away, leaving the estate empty, Daniel turned to Emma. "This feels like the start of something new," he said. Emma nodded, her smile soft. "It is, and I think it's going to be good." Daniel reached for her hand, holding it gently. "I think so too." And as the snow fell softly around them, the world seemed to hold its breath, filled with the quiet promise of a new beginning. In the end, Daniel discovered that the true gifts of Christmas aren't wrapped in boxes or tied with bows. They're found in connection, honesty, and the courage to let love into your life. His journey from hiding behind a facade to embracing vulnerability reminds us all that even the wealthiest hearts can feel empty without genuine relationships. If this story warmed your heart, please give it a thumbs up, share it with friends who love a good holiday tale, and subscribe to our channel for more uplifting stories. Let's keep spreading the magic of love and connection, one story at a time.